viewers, in today's video let us learn about the industrial production of whiskey. Whiskey is a distilled alcoholic beverage which is obtained from the fermentation of grains. After fermentation, the fermented contents or the whiskey is put for aging in a white oak barrel for about 3 to 4 years. Primarily, whiskey is usually produced from a barley grain. But apart from barley grain, other cereals such as corn, wheat, oat, rye can also be used for whiskey production. Now the grains that we are using for whiskey production can be partially germinated or it can be ungerminated. Now these partially germinated grains are called as malt. So using this malt, whiskey can be produced, or the non-germinated grains can also be used for whiskey production. The concentration of alcohol that is usually present in whiskey is not less than 40%, which means it will be always more than 40%. Now depending upon the brand, the percentage of alcohol also varies. Some brand will have 40%, some brand will have 48%, or some brand will have 42%. The alcohol percentage will vary depending upon the brand, but it will be always more than 40%. Now the color, the brown color that we see in the whiskey is usually obtained from the addition of caramel, that is burnt sugar. If we look into the history of whiskey production, whiskey production was first begun in Scotland. So all of you would have heard about Scotch. So Scotland is very famous for whiskey production. But some believe that Arabs and Greek started the whiskey production first. Later on, some believe that Irish started the whiskey production 1000 years ago, but now the record is very clear that the whiskey production began in Scotland. But some written records still now suggest that it was started in 1494. So this history is not very clear, but still many people believe that whiskey production was first begun in Scotland. So let us look into the various steps that are involved in whiskey production. So the first step is called as malting. Mashing is the second step, and then fermentation is being carried out. After fermentation, the fermented contents are put for distillation. After distillation, an aging procedure will be carried out, and after aging, blending of whiskey will take place. Now let us look into each of these steps in detail. The first step is called as malting. So malting and mashing we have already seen in our previous video as well when we did beer production. So malting is a very essential step to activate the enzymes that are present in the grains. Now why do we activate the enzymes that are present in the grains? Is because these grains will have huge amount of carbon source in the form of starch, and there will be proteins as well. Now we have to make available this carbon source for the microorganism that we will be using. So the organism that we usually use in whiskey production is nothing but Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a yeast species which is a very important inoculum which is usually used in all the alcohol production. Now malting involves the soaking of grains in a water for about 2 to 3 days. Now why do we have to soak the grains in water is because during this soaking procedure, the moisture that is there in the water, the moisture will be absorbed by the grains and the grains will start germinating. So when it is germinating, the enzymes are activated. The enzymes like amylases and proteases that is there in the grains are activated to break down the starch and to convert it into carbon source, like simple sugar sources, which can be readily available for the yeast to accept and ferment. So soaking of the grains will occur. So if it is a barley grain, then the barley grains will be soaked in the water for a few days to activate the enzymes. Enzymes will get activated to break down the complex carbohydrates into simple sugars. After partial germination, the grains are taken and they are subjected to a temperature of about 90 degrees Celsius to inactivate the enzyme. Now why do we have to inactivate the enzyme is because we don't want all the starch to get converted into simple sugar and all the simple sugars to be utilized by the grain itself to grow into an embryo. If we allow the complete germination to take place, then the grain will become a plant. We don't want the plant to be developed. We don't want embryo to develop into a plant, but we don't want the embryo to grow. We just want the starch to be converted into simple sugars. So therefore partial germination is done. After partial germination, the grains are subjected to 90 degrees Celsius temperature, higher temperature, to inactivate all the enzymes so that further breaking down of starch will not take place and the embryo will not develop into a plant. So once this enzymes are inactivated, the grains are ground into a coarse flour. Later, this coarse flour that we obtain is put for mashing. So as I told you, the malted grains is ground and it is mixed with cereals as well, so that cereals like oat, rye or corn, so that the taste is being improved. After it is mixed with cereals, it is finally subjected to hot water. They are going to soak it in the hot water for several days. Now why they are going to soak it in hot water is because when they put it in hot water for about 1 to 2 days, here the simple sugars that are present in the grain or the flour will be extracted into the water. Now this water that we get after putting in boiling water, the water will have the sugars. Now this water that we get is called as wort. So the water is filtered, which contains this liquid that we get, the filtrate that we get will contain enough amount of sugars that is required for fermentation by yeast. That we call it as a sweet wort because the wort contains the sugars. After filtration, the filtrate is called as wort. Later, this wort is taken and it is put for fermentation. Now we can go for either batch fermentation or continuous fermentation. The most commonly employed fermentation process is batch fermentation. Now the pH that has to be maintained is usually 4.8 to 5 and the temperature is 28 to 30 degrees Celsius. The inoculum is nothing but the yeast, that is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is inoculated into the fermented tank by a process called as pitching. Now what is pitching also we have discussed in my previous video. So you can look into my previous videos on alcohol production or beer production to more about pitching. Now after fermentation process, the contents that we get is allowed to sediment. So during this sedimentation process, all the yeast debris or if there are any cereal husk or if there are any cereal grains that has to settle down, will settle down. The supernatant is collected. The sedimentation is done in the fermented tank itself. Later the supernatant is collected and moved into another settling tank where further sedimentation will take place. Now during this further sedimentation, the yeast cells that are there will undergo a secondary fermentation. So if there are any left out sugar present even after fermentation, those sugars will be converted into alcohol. Later, after a sedimentation process, the supernatant is collected and it is put for distillation. In Scotland, distillation is carried out usually in copper containers. The copper plant or a stainless steel plant, usually they use a copper plant to do a distillation process because the copper will kill most of the microorganisms and the yeast. We know that copper is a metal which is having a oligodynamic action. So oligodynamic means it is going to kill the microorganism. So copper is used for distillation and copper will also add a flavor to the whiskey. That is why copper containers are usually used for whiskey production or distillation of whiskey. So distillation principle we all know, it is nothing but the evaporation and condensation process. So the contents, the supernatant that we have obtained is usually evaporated at about 78 to 80 degrees Celsius. So the alcohol gets evaporated. The evaporated alcohol is collected in the, when it is condensed, it becomes a liquid. So it is collected. So the distilled, after distillation, whatever liquid you get is your whiskey. Now this will usually have 90% of alcohol in it. Later, this alcohol that we obtain is diluted with the addition of water to obtain the solution of alcohol content for about 50 to 65%. So alcohol is added to bring the water is added to the alcohol to bring down the percentage of alcohol. Later, this alcohol is nothing but whiskey is kept for aging. Now during aging, what they do is the whiskey that has been obtained after distillation will be stored in white oak barrel, and the mouth of the barrel will be sealed and kept in a cool and wet condition. In Scotland, the aging process will usually occur in cool and wet condition, whereas in America, the aging is done in warm and dry condition. During aging, the white oak barrel that is there, the alcohol that is there, whiskey, is going to react with the white oak barrel. Therefore, the white oak barrel will release some amount of tannins and esters into the whiskey, which will add flavor to the whiskey. We call them as congeners. Esters, sugars or alcohols are being produced from the white oak barrel, and it has been released into the whiskey. We call them as congeners. So they give a special aroma and flavor to the whiskey. So aging is conducted for minimum of 3 to 4 years and maximum up to 10 to 15 years. So aging will be in the white oak barrels. The whiskey will be stored for about so many years. More the aging, more is the flavor. So more the whiskey will be of better quality. So aging process is done for many years. So this whiskey that has been obtained now after aging will be blended. Now what is blending? Whiskey is produced in batches. Now from all the batches, these batches will be put into aging. So there will be different batches of whiskey which has undergone aging process. Now they take all the different batches of whiskey and they mix them together. They blend them together. At the same time, the appropriate proportion of wine also is added. There is a wine known as sherry pot. This wine is also added so that there is a mixed development of flavors. So this mixed flavors will make the whiskey better. The flavor of the whiskey will be better when it is blended together. So different batches of whiskey is being blended, and also the whiskey will be blended with wine as well. Finally, the caramel mix, the burnt sugar mix, is added in appropriate amount to develop a suitable color into the whiskey. Later, the final product is bottled, sealed and sold in the market. That is all about the industrial production of whiskey. Thank you all. If you have liked my video, please hit the like button, share my video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you all.